very warm welcome to this How To Academy event. The latest, actually the last of our summer at homes with, and we are at home this evening with Lord Robert Winston, Professor Robert Winston. He's had the most extraordinary career. I don't really know where to start, but he's currently a Professor of Science and Society at Imperial College London. He's had no fewer than 23 honorary doctorates. He's won BAFTAs, as I think as his son, who may even have been nominated for a BAFTA this very day for something entirely different, an entirely different sphere. He's a Labour peer as well. He's sitting on one of the parliamentary committees that is, as it were, auditing our response, or the government's response to COVID. He's written 20 books, 4 of which have won Royal Society awards. And of course, he's most famous for being a fertility treatment pioneer. He's basically helped a huge number of human beings bring other human beings into the world. And what better legacy than that? He's a massive fan of Schubert. He's a probably even bigger fan of Arsenal. And unbelievably, he turned 80 this year. I think he must be, as you're about to see, be the youngest looking 80-year-old anywhere on the planet. So thank you to Robert for joining us. Thank you to you for joining us wherever you are in the world. I'm sure you're scattered far and wide. My name's Matt Stadlen. I'm a presenter on LBC. I'll be hosting my show as ever tonight at 1 o'clock if you wish to tune in. But for the moment, Robert, a very warm welcome to you. Thank you for joining us at home.
Thank you for having me. Yeah.
We should probably start with the big picture, heavy stuff. The reason we're at home with you and not on stage is because we're still in the middle of this pandemic. And as of the last 24 hours in Britain, we seem to be slightly going backwards.
Yes, well, we probably are a bit, but you know what? I have a different view, I think, from what is widely portrayed. I mean, I think that we have to see this as a huge opportunity. I think it's a great opportunity for young people, and I think it's a great opportunity for all sorts of people that we haven't really thought about. Of course, there are massive difficulties at the moment and all sorts of threats which people are facing, including ill health and being incarcerated almost. But actually, in time, we will undoubtedly defeat this virus. The work that's going on scientifically is unprecedented. I don't think there's ever been quite so much published in peer-reviewed journals about any other scientific issue. And we are learning a great deal from how we respond to this virus, which affects the whole of the human body in all sorts of other ways. So, for example, we're learning about the immune system in ways which we never thought we would, and which will be relevant to things from aging to childbirth. And I think that that's going to be really very important. And there's no doubt in my mind that we will find a vaccine. I mean, already there are about 440 being explored. We will also, I think, be likely to find very effective antivirals. And there are ways of looking at that very positively. Certainly the chemistry that's going on is very interesting. And there's no question that we'll get better diagnosis. I mean, I think the biggest fault has been our failure to make diagnosis much more promptly, because I think that is something which we need to be doing. The problem with this virus, and let me just finish before I talk about it anymore, I think the problem with this virus is really that it is not quite unique, but almost unique, because it's one of the few infections which is infectious before it causes any symptoms. And that's been very, very difficult. And that's why every country has had a problem trying to deal with it.
Do you think that we are going to stumble on treatments for other diseases? You suggested that we're beginning to understand the body and the immune system better than we perhaps had done through the work that is going into COVID.
Absolutely, no question. This virus triggers the immune system in ways which are almost unique, and it affects immune cells, which are almost unique, and the cells which protect us against infection. So actually, that is really important. And I think the other issue, of course, is this, that one thing I think we have to say is we're going to have to live with the virus, but I think we will control it. And, you know, I think the sad thing is that, for example, the select committee that I sat on in 2006 and the one in 2012, and then there was another one in 2015, all of these predicted there would be a pandemic. And unfortunately, no government, not just the present government, took any notice of it. Or didn't take sufficient notice. And that was not just unique to the United Kingdom, that was actually almost universal, except in a very few countries. And a very few countries that were so aware actually have done rather better. So, for example, 1 or 2 Asian countries have done better than we have, even though their medicine is probably not nearly as advanced. But I think in the long term, we will always have new pandemics of new viruses. It's the nature of viruses that they will, in fact, present a different threat, because viruses are capable of change. However, there are many hopeful things about COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2, as we call it. And those are things which I think offer it open to be quite vulnerable to specific attack, which we will be able to use.
Because you've moved yourself, you've mutated in a way from saying that we're going to defeat this virus to we're going to have to live with this virus. So just explain how those two thoughts are compatible.
Well, I'll give you an example. We're living perfectly well with HIV, aren't we? We're living perfectly well with polio. Those are two viruses which used to be thought to be absolutely fatal, very serious. I mean, when I was a schoolboy, my school was shut down because of one person infected with polio, because it was so infectious and it was so dangerous to the neurological system. So, I mean, viruses aren't new. And of course, probably historically, the plague of Athens was probably a virus, almost certainly. And of course, we have a constant virus, which we have not managed to deal with, which is also a coronavirus, which is the common cold. Not all of the common cold is due to the coronavirus, but a good proportion is due to the coronavirus, and we've still not managed to beat it. There are lots of reasons for that, but it's partly because, of course, we've never really invested in trying to beat it.
Is it just that coronavirus is so infectious? Is it that it is, as you say, infectious before it becomes symptomatic?
It is
highly... We have reacted in this way, or is there something else about it? So, I mean, obviously, it's taking lives as well.
Well, I mean, I have to say that, bear in mind, I'm not a virologist, and I'm certainly not an epidemiologist, but it is a fairly infectious to very infectious viral disease. But there are more viruses which are much more infectious. Ebola is one, but of course its method of transfer is different. And unfortunately for humans, this particular virus has got two things which are quite worrying, one of which it's carried in droplet infection. So it's very quickly spread because it comes in the air as an aerosol. And I suppose the other thing about this virus is that it seems to have come through our association with animals, probably bats. Now, that's not unique. Bats actually carry a lot of viruses. I could tell you a nice story about filming with bats in Costa Rica, which is quite funny, really. But
go on, tell us, distract us.
I'll tell you, I mean, this is many years ago. I was filming a piece about altruism, and we decided, typically, to look at the evolution of altruism. And one of the animals that's most altruistic is the vampire bat. Turns out vampire bats can't survive if they have a stomach empty of blood for more than 48 hours, something like that. So they go out and hunt for animals that they can suck blood from. And so we decided to go and film vampire bats in their habitat and in the jungle in Costa Rica, where it's really inaccessible. And of course, you have to do it at midnight when there's no light. So I and my huge cameraman climbed into this hollow tree with a biologist to protect us, to make certain there was nothing else there. And of course, I knew perfectly well that one of the things that's really dangerous that they carry is tuberculosis. Well, I'm probably immunized against that. But there are a whole range of other viruses which we're not good at treating, but we can treat, one of which is rabies. And that's one thing that I could protect myself with. And as I went into the trunk of the tree, I gave my vial of rabies vaccine to the cameraman and said, look, do you mind putting this in my arm? And then I looked at him, he was huge. And I saw his hand tremble. I said, look, I'll tell you what, I think I'd rather give my own injection to myself. We climbed into the tree, into this hollow in complete darkness, at midnight. And then actually, suddenly there was a scream from the biologist, get out, get out. And we clambered out quickly. And there was a huge poisonous snake at the bottom and a monstrous tarantula as well. So, but we got our film. They're pretty nasty looking creatures. I actually held one to the camera, holding its wings so it couldn't bite me. I thought it was quite brave, actually, because looking at my face, and it's a nasty rat little face, it's really horrible. It was trying to bite, but it couldn't. Sorry?
Just having worked in science for almost all of your life and understanding it so much better than most of us, does that have an impact on whether you have feared the coronavirus?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think... I think we all would be very frightened of the coronavirus. I think one is always frightened of any infection because anybody who is vaguely medical or vaguely scientific or even not will know that the biggest, we always think of the biggest threat facing mankind as climate change, but it never was. in my view, infection in general is a very, very serious threat. It still kills far more people in the world than anything else. And our resistance to infection, you know, one of the greatest, most serious pieces of technology, every piece of technology we invent is really risky. And one of the most risky of all technologies, and I say this in schools when I go and I say, what's the most risky technology you can think of? And they obviously don't know. And I put a photograph of an aircraft, you know, a BA, British Airways aircraft, 747 or whatever, on the screen. I say, that's the most dangerous piece of technology. And I say, why? And they all say, well, because it can drop bombs. No. Well, because, you know, it might crash. Not really. Because, of course, it will bring a pathogen from an area which our immune system has never seen before within a few hours and to which we have no defense. And actually, of course, historically, that's exactly what happened with the plague in 1347, of course. We were suddenly exposed to a bacterium that we had no defense because we'd never seen it before. And it was brought in by the latest technology, which were ships, of course. Ships coming in from Asia carried that organism inside rats, and we got infected, and it wiped out swathes of Europe. I mean, in some countries, one fifth to one half of the population, and in Britain, certainly whole villages were wiped out in places, and certainly the economy of Europe in those days was probably altered by about 100 years. It probably held back the economy for a long time. I don't think that will happen with this virus. I think we've got much wiser, but we still need to learn more.
It's a grim conversation so far for a Friday evening. Of course, you're famous for bringing life into the world, and here we are talking about death. But I can't leave this entirely to one side yet, because I've got a couple more questions that your answers prompt. One of which is, I mean, you mentioned Ebola, for example. One of which is, how likely is it that a disease such as Ebola would run rampant around the world? I mean, it was contained to West Africa, the last outbreak, wasn't it?
Well, I think the story of Ebola is a bit shameful, actually, because we knew about Ebola for many decades. It's not new, but it sort of surfaced in, 2013, 2014, something like that in West Africa. But actually, it had been going on for a long time, but we really didn't care very much because basically it just affected Black Africans. We didn't see it as a threat. And then suddenly we found they could get on planes and they could possibly cause an infection. But the problem is, although it's a very infectious disease, it isn't transmitted with droplet infection. It's only when somebody actually, you come in contact with their blood or their body fluids, or they vomit on you, that actually you might get infected. So actually, although it's more infectious, it's much less risky. And so really, Ebola would be very unlikely, I think, as it stands at the moment, unless it altered its transmission, to wipe out the world's population. And nearly all these organisms have some flaw which would prevent that from happening, added to which it's actually not in the interests of the virus, I mean, in terms of genetics, to kill everybody, because once it's done that, it kills its host. So in Darwinian terms, actually, it needs to make somebody ill, perhaps, but not so ill that it can't replicate.
That's fascinating. So leaving Ebola to one side, what prospect then, despite what you've just said, of a disease that could wipe out the world population?
But I don't know. I think you'd have to ask, I think you should ask you should ask the Regis Professor of Physics at Oxford that question. It's an interesting question. I'm not sure I could do that. John Bell, I mean, he might be able to answer that question. I'm not sure. But I think, we have enough organisms in Britain which are really common, which are very serious, that we're not taking as seriously as we should do. Because, of course, you and I, we replicate every 20 years. Basically, our time when we become fertile and have a child is 20 years. So if you assume that in the last 100,000 years, Homo sapiens has been on Earth, that's very few generations. You divide that by 20, it's very few. It's a few thousand generations. But if you take for example, take a bacterium like E. coli, which is a pretty nasty bacterium in the wrong circumstances, that might be dividing every 20 minutes. So at the end of 24 hours, with one of those bacteria, you have trillions of bacteria just from one organism if they're not stopped. So of course, it's capable of adapting to that environment very quickly. So when you give it an antibiotic, of course, it's able, the ones that are resistant to the antibiotic the new versions, will actually be resistant. So it's classic Darwinian evolution, effectively. And so we need to be much cleverer about understanding that we have to find new ways of destroying bacteria, and our current antibiotics are becoming less useful. And we need to be much more aware that we've got to be avoiding giving these drugs unless we really need to, because we will encourage resistance.
And does that bring us back to the way that we husband the land and treat our planet?
Yes, I think so. I personally think that's true. That's controversial, but we are using antibiotics to promote growth in cattle. I'm not sure that's wise, and there is some question whether that could creep in to human use indirectly, of course, in the water supply or whatever. I think it's sufficiently of concern to be very aware that we should not be giving them to animals, for just husbandry. And I think we would also clearly say that we should not be giving antibiotics to children unnecessarily, which is one of the biggest problems.
What do you think we've learned about ourselves, Robert, during this pandemic?
That's a wonderful question. And I think it's open to argument. A lot of people are saying the world will not be the same again. That may be right, but we might just revert to exactly the same again very shortly, because in fact, I think sometimes it's worth looking at history. How much did we learn from the great flu epidemic of 1919, 1920? With hindsight, we didn't learn that much. I mean, people did change their behavior for a bit, but probably we haven't learned much. But on the other hand, I have to say that human behavior, I think, does improve all the time, irrespective of threats. If you ask me, would I rather live in 2020 than 1920, I'm very clear I'd rather live now. And would I rather live in 1820 or 1920? I'd definitely rather live in 1920. And I would certainly rather live in 1820 than 1720. Because actually, if you think back historically what was happening in all those times, on the whole, human behavior, human resources, human ambition, humans' ability have improved. And actually, I think our society has become, on the whole, more morally aware. And that's interesting. I mean, people forget that sometimes. But actually, we are probably far more aware of the dangers of violence and of prejudice and hate and so on than we ever were. And I think we have learned a great deal about ourselves. And in some way, unquestionably, the lockdown, I think, has undoubtedly made people think about themselves and their behavior and just reflect. I've been writing a memoir during this lockdown. Actually, it's interesting you started the way you did, because I've been writing a chapter about death, actually, at the moment. And nothing to what we've said already. It's a totally different idea of death. I mean, I've gone from Michel de Montaigne, actually, and various other slightly esoteric references. And also things that I've seen when I've seen people die, either as a doctor or whatever, including miscarriage, which is part of death. And I think if you take death, it's really quite interesting, because I was thinking the other day, when we made the first program where we showed a death on television in The Time of the Human Body, the last program, Herbie, our man dying in Ireland, there were protests that the BBC had made a snuff movie. And we had horrendous criticism in the Daily Mail before we broadcast it, before anybody had seen it. And I ended up writing a piece for one of the newspapers saying, look, actually, what we've done is really important. We have really tried to show death as something which is happening to everybody eventually, and it's part of our existence, and it's inevitable. And what was fascinating to me was I was very conscious of that exposure. And I was walking along the road in Edinburgh in a back street one evening after that had been transmitted. And I saw a man crossing the road towards me. And I thought, oh God, this is a groupie. And, because I'm not very keen. I'm not very good about being recognized, actually, but he'd seen me and it was obviously he'd recognized me. And he came up to me and he stopped. He said, look, I want to tell you about your program on Herbie. And I said, yes. He said, my father died 6 months ago and I've been absolutely devastated by that. And your program, for the first time, helped me come to terms with actually his death. And that was, I thought, hey, that's really quite important, that actually we could talk about death openly and show how he died in the way he did die. And that idea of having dignity in death is very important. And I don't want to go on too long, but I just remember when I did a GP locum, when I was still a very young doctor, I was told by the GP who left for his holiday, look, this man is dying of lung cancer. I want you to go to his room, his house every day and give him the heroin and the brandy to help him stop coughing and to put him at peace. And, you know, I want you to visit him. You mustn't not visit him. He must not go to hospital. And I thought, well, that's obviously what people do. They put them in hospital. He said he must not go to hospital because if he dies, he'll die at home and he'll die with more dignity. I thought it was very wise, and it made me think.
What have you learned about life through your experience of death as a doctor?
That's a fascinating question. I think it's too complicated to answer very quickly, but I think it ranges from the fact that death is necessary, in fact, for, that we're not going to prolong life greatly. I mean, first of all, I think one of the things is very clear that the idea that we're going to live for 1,000 years, which has been suggested by Aubrey de Grey, for example, in Cambridge, is completely unrealistic. I think we might be extending human longevity to 120, maybe 130. But I think that what I think I've learned is that on the whole, it's probably better to accept what's happening and learn what's happening than not. And I think part of the problem with death is that it's so frightening because it's so unknown. And I remember, just very briefly, this is a very personal note. I remember when my mother died at age 95, and the only person around was my youngest son, Ben. And I was working in a clinic, and I got the phone call from Ben, and he said, look, I don't think Granny's very well. I'm with her at the moment, and she's not responding. And I said, Ben, it's possible she might have died. I'll be right with you, but it's going to take me at least half an hour to get to you. I said, you're incredibly lucky. And so was she, I said, because you were the last person to see her, and she was the last person who saw you, that you saw. And the idea that actually he'd been privileged in that way, I think was an important concept. And I think, when I got there, he was completely calm. It was the first time he'd seen anybody die. And I think, that is one of the great sadnesses about the COVID epidemic, that so many people have died without anybody next to them. And that, to my mind, is horrible, that their relatives can't go and see them. It seems to me to be something that we've done very badly. We could have done better. We should have had more protective gear to make that possible. I
was with my grandmother actually on the day or the night that she died. She was run over by a taxi outside her house in Hampstead. And I think that we found a silver lining in her death, in that the one thing that she feared, and she was a fearless person, she was a Jewish refugee, and she went to fight colonialism really in what was then Ceylon in the 1930s, 1940s. But I think the one thing she feared was losing her mind. She didn't want not to be compos mentis. And I interviewed Sir Jonathan Miller many years ago, a decade ago, for one of my old, actually 5 Minutes with series for the BBC, for which I interviewed you. And I asked him about death. And he was not frightened of it in the slightest, but he was concerned, not the fact of it, not the end of it, but what he was concerned about was the pain that might lead up to it. The sad thing about that story, of course, was that Jonathan really did lose his mind towards the end, and that's really sad. I mean, he was a remarkable individual, so talented, brilliant individual. And I think to some extent, he was always searching. He never quite found where he should be. It seemed to me strange for somebody who was so successful and done so many brilliant things that he should feel so uncertain. I first met him when I was 13, and he was just about to go to Cambridge. He was leaving school, and I was just arriving at school. And he played the part of Cleopatra on a chaise longue, leaning back, answering the telephone, consulting his diary, seeing whether he could meet this individual. And he was wonderful, vamping up Cleopatra with the headdress. And I had a non-speaking part. My voice hadn't broken, and I played his fangirl in the school review. What a wonderful image.
Yes. I mean,
he like you, Robert, there was something that binds you two together as well. is that briefly, I think in your late 20s, you stopped science and went to become a theatre director. And you in fact, were an award-winning theatre director. And Jonathan Miller, of course, was himself, I think, a doctor or certainly a scientist before he then dedicated his life to the arts.
We did sort of cross in that respect, because he did something immediately after qualification, and I took a leaf out of his book. He decided that, I think he wasn't quite sure whether he wanted to go into the arts or not at that stage. So he did a job in pathology, which is a very sensible thing to do, because it first of all gives you the basic science. You're not on call at nights, and you can knock off at 3 o'clock in the afternoon and do other stuff. And so, he was very successful. He did that in a good path lab, which gave him a salary while he was, I think, deciding what to do. And so when I had qualified and decided I wanted to try and do theatre a bit more seriously, I did a path job. And so I followed his example, and I was so lucky. I had the most wonderful man called Peter Whitehead, who was the brilliant consultant in charge, and he understood exactly what I needed. But what was great, of course, for me was that the pathology was gripping, because when you look at tissues under a microscope, or when you dissect a dead body to do a post-mortem, you learn so much that you're not really taught until that actually happens. You can't learn that in lessons or by slides. And to my mind, one of the things I learned was that no matter how hard you look down a microscope, no matter how you test the tissue, looking down a microscope never gives you quite the answer. There's always something that you will not understand. So you say, well, this might be a cancer. This probably is a cancer. This is very likely to be a cancer. This may be malignant. And that is fascinating. It's not quite as, people think of it, doctors think of it as black and white too, but actually the beautiful thing about pathology, it's nuanced. It's quite grey at times. And that, I think, is wonderful. It's a wonderful example of how the more we do stuff, the less we know.